Alrighty, welcome everyone into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, May 29th, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about roster construction. It feels like this might be a year where some philosophies change around the country, possibly. Then we'll get into a little bit of talk around the SEC spring meeting. Some very interesting quotes have come out from Greg Sankey and Kirby Smart and Billy Napier around all of the different stuff going on around the House settlement, around Jaden Rashada's lawsuit is a huge topic of conversation as well. Then we'll talk about Nyck Harbor, a very, very talented athletic kid that might just be in the Olympics this time, sometime in the summer. Then we'll get into the most important players, non-quarterbacks, of course, for the big-time contenders. We did the 5 teams yesterday. We did their most important coaches. Now we're going to do the most important players, and we'll likely go back and forth with that for a little bit while we get through the contenders this year. And then we have another Spotlight Wednesday for you, and it is the Kentucky Wildcats. Definitely a ton riding on this year, a ton going into this year with a lot of different expectations. So we'll break down them towards the end of the show there. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have a kind of fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's good for all of us. But let's go ahead and jump right in, and let's talk about this roster construction issue, I suppose you could call it. But the transfer portal has been a big time player in college football for quite some time. Pretty much whenever it came to the forefront of the sport, a lot of people have been using it, and obviously there's been tons of different approaches to it. You can go everywhere from Deion Sanders to Dabo Swinney and find everything in between those two philosophies. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this obviously unfold over the next couple of years, but I want to focus in on this year a little bit, just a little bit closer, because when I look around the country this year, it feels like more than any other year, there are tons of teams that are slated to do really, really big things this upcoming year that also have a ton of transfer talent that is not only coming in, but coming in to start and coming in to play big-time snaps. So I think you talk about Ole Miss. They brought in 22 guys. A lot of those guys are going to get big-time snaps. You also have Florida State brought in 17. Same exact thing for them, especially with DJ being one of those guys. You then have, A&M added 28 guys. They could definitely make some noise. Miami and Bama added 15. Oregon added 14. And all of those guys on all 3 of those teams are really going to play big-time snaps. There's very few in those transfer portal classes that are not going to play right away for those teams. So it gives you an idea of kind of where the world is heading a little bit. And Colorado, obviously, with 42 incoming transfers, is just out of this world. But it gives you an idea of kind of where everyone's head's at. If you were to ask me, I tend to lean that anywhere between 8 to 15 guys is likely the area you want to be in, because you likely want the portal to be kind of patchwork instead of, building the entire team. You want it to be something to supplement the team, and I think that's usually the way that you see the big-time programs use it. Bama up towards the top at 15, but they lost a lot of guys as well, so they kind of had to be towards the top at 15. Same thing with Oregon, same thing with Miami, where you're still trying to kind of build out those rosters the way you want to see them. So I definitely believe that that's kind of the area you want to be in. Now, if you go a little bit above that, a little bit below that, it doesn't necessarily hurt you by any means. I think the big-time examples we've seen, I suppose, of teams that have added 20-plus kids and had really successful seasons are 2021 Michigan State with Kenneth Walker and Peyton Thorne and all of those guys, and then 2022 USC when Caleb Williams and Lincoln Riley came over. So those were both great teams, don't get me wrong. Both won 10 games, both did really incredible things and had guys on their teams that were, Heisman favorites at one point with Kenneth Walker, or the Heisman winner with Caleb Williams, but they didn't win their conference. So in the past, at least, it looks like there have been kind of a peak of what these teams can be, of what all these new, transfer portal influx of kids, they can be plenty talented and you can have really good teams, but you're going to need a different gear to get over that next level, is what it seemed like in the past. But it feels like there are a couple of teams this year that could possibly, blaze a new path in the transfer portal world. And the 2 I really want to focus in on are Ole Miss and Florida State. I think 2 of these teams are not only, relying on the transfer portal a ton going into this season, but also have a lot of aspirations for the season. Florida State coming off the year they just had 13-0, want to be back in that national conversation. And then Ole Miss bringing in a lot of the guys they did, they expect to be right there in the thick of things for the SEC this upcoming year. So it's going to be fascinating to watch these two teams. Let's start with Ole Miss. And as a team, they have a ton of things in place, and they had a ton of things in place before a lot of these transfers got here. But when you look at this team overall, if the transfer portal class does not hit, they're going to be very similar to what they were a year ago. Now, I think they did a great job of getting really experienced guys. They got Walter Nolan, they got Cam Alexander, they got Juice Wells on the offensive side of the ball. So they did a great job of getting the right guys in that building, so to say, if you're talking about the transfer portal. But you never really know how the 11 guys on defense are going to gel, because out of those 11, I would bet 5 of the starters will be transfer portal guys, at least 5 starters, possibly 6. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this kind of take shape. I think Ole Miss has every ability to be a SEC champion, to go into the playoff, to do remarkable things. Now, the offensive line gives me a little bit of worry. I think Nyck is a great player. I think some of the guys they brought in are big-time players, but I'm still a little bit skeptical of if they can put together the season that they need to on the front. But I do think they have that ability. They have tons of experience with the guys that they're bringing in, especially guys like Walter Nolan, Cam Alexander, and you have tons of chances to break down the door, to win the SEC, to do really remarkable things. The question is, can you do that? Can you buck the stereotypes that followed Michigan State and USC in past years and become a team that kind of sets its own path? And then when you talk about Florida State, it's a little bit different. They brought in fewer guys, of course, but they also had more guys leave for the NFL and things of that nature. And also, this is kind of the way Mike Norvell goes about business. He's done this in the past. He's obviously hung out around that kind of 17, 20, 15, kind of that area of transfer portal people, but all of them have been big-time players. You added Braden Fisk, you added Jared Verse, tons of players on either side of the ball. Keon Coleman, obviously a great example. Tons of guys on either side of the ball that made big-time impacts for them, and this year is no different. You have DJ Uiagalelei. He needs to hit. That's a non-negotiable for Florida State to be as good as they're going to be. He needs to play probably better football than he has played in the past and be the player that they're hoping that he can be, really. And then you have Roydell Williams coming in from Alabama needs to hit. Malik Benson needs to get healthy, of course, first. But once he gets healthy, I think he probably needs to be their wide receiver 1. So the way I look at Florida State is, if all of those guys hit, if they did what they've done in the past and picked out really, really good guys in the transfer portal, then they'll be fine, and they'll be in the ACC conversation, and everything will be fine and dandy down in Tallahassee. But if DJ doesn't work out, if he's, throws for 58% on the season, completion percentage, and doesn't necessarily light the world on fire, you're going to have a lot of questions. And it's going to be one of those years where you're left kind of wondering, what happened to the team that we had a year ago. And obviously a lot of those guys found their way out the door, but this defense is going to be really good still. And it won't matter much, to be totally honest with you, if DJ cannot hit the way that they're hoping. So those are two teams that absolutely could kind of buck these stereotypes and become a part of the national conversation and kind of get, beyond all of the craziness that has followed some of the transfer portal teams in the past. But they're still walking a little bit of a tightrope in a couple of those places. And then, obviously, the big-time example that would change the entire way that people go about business is if Colorado hits. If Dion and Colorado somehow figure out a way to make all this work, everyone's going to have to rethink the way they go about business. He added 52 guys in year 1. He's had 42 this year. So it's an entirely new team from when he showed up. And to be totally fair to him, that had to happen. It was a 1-11 team. It was not a team that was going to compete nationally, and you had to switch those guys out. Now, he did it very, very quickly, and definitely ruffled some feathers in the process, but the reality is this is the way he wants to go about business. He wants to build through the portal, not necessarily supplement, and if he can pull it off, it'll be a remarkable thing to watch. I think one of the things that I always think about when I look at Colorado is a lot of things could go right for them. A ton of things could go right. They could have a lot of transfer portal guys hit. They could have, a ton of good breaks in games. and they could still be an 8-9 win team. That's just the reality of where they're at right now. There's not a lot of depth on this team. There's not a lot of ability to really compete at the national level, at least from where I'm standing right now. Now, could they, figure things out, win 9 games, win 10 games, maybe even bust the door down and win the Big 12 and totally make people rethink the way they go about business? Sure. I just think they're definitely a thinner path than most and probably walking the tightest tightrope in the entirety of college football. And then you get into some other teams. You have Miami brought in 15 guys. You have Michigan State brought in 24, Washington 29, Louisville 31, Indiana 31. So tons of teams are leaning on this, and some of it is out of absolute necessity, like Colorado, like Michigan State lost a ton of guys. You have Florida State had to go into the portal to get some of these guys. So obviously some of these teams are doing it out of necessity. Some of these teams are doing it because that's the way they want to go about business. And that's all well and good. I think if there was a year to kind of buck those stereotypes and kind of make transfer portal be the way you want to build a team instead of supplement a team, this might be the year. I think Ole Miss has a great opening to become a team that you look up in November and they have one loss or heading to a playoff game, and a lot of the reason for that will be the transfer portal guys. Now, if you were to ask me, I tend to believe it's going to stay the same way. I tend to believe high school evaluation, recruiting, development are the meat, cheese, and bread of this sandwich. And then the transfer portal can be, the lettuce, the tomato, the onion, the mayo, whatever you want on that. But the reality is, from where I'm standing, the best teams in the country, the best programs in the country still recruit at the best. Georgia, Ohio State, all of those teams still recruit at the very, very top level on the high school level. And then they figure out what they need in the transfer portal, and then they go get it. So I tend to believe that's the way to go about business. Now, that can change. All of this can change very quickly, and I think if that was going to change at really any point in the future, this year might be the year to do it, because so many teams have that ability to get to a national perspective, but also do it with a lot of big-time transfer portal guys helping them out on the way there. So this will be kind of a fascinating thing to watch. If Ole Miss makes some noise, if Florida State makes some noise, especially if Colorado makes some noise, there will be some conversations being had with GMs, with head coaches, with position coaches about the way they want to build out their roster and how they want to go about business from here forward. But that'll be fascinating to watch. But we're going to take our first break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the SEC spring meetings, the House case, the Jaden Rashada lawsuit had dominated conversation around there, but tons of really, really interesting things to look into, so we will definitely break that down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows with 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about roster construction and how 2024 could be a year where a lot of that changes around the country. Tons of teams with a ton of transfer portal guys that they could bring in that could have big time effects on their team. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. I think that's something that we will be watching very, very closely this upcoming year. But also, we had SEC spring meetings, and that is a very, very interesting thing because there's a lot of stuff going on around college football and specifically around the SEC. The House case has kind of dominated this discussion, as well as the Jaden Rashada lawsuit, but there's tons of stuff to break down. So let's jump right in. Let's talk about all of this stuff. And it's one of those things where you get into this time of year and you're in a little bit of a lull, right? There is no spring football to talk about. There's no spring games to break down, but there's also not really time for predictions. I'm not getting into predictions till about August, so we have a little bit of a lull here. Now we have spring meetings. We have tons of stuff to break down in the meantime, so very much appreciate the SEC for giving us this, but the House versus NCAA settlement has dominated the conversations throughout the first couple of days there. This will continue throughout the week, and they'll continue talking about this throughout the week, to be totally honest with you. Greg Sankey started the meeting talking about kind of the future of college athletics and the future of his conference in particular, and essentially just said a lot of this stuff is, mostly fine. They talked about the idea of employment, and he was kind of dismissive of that, just said it's not necessarily, what people really want in this entire thing. So I don't necessarily think that's something that, at least in the short term, is going to be pursued from the SEC's perspective. So that's a little fascinating to hear. Also, we got some very interesting details just from coaches about how they feel about the new settlement. Most of them were very, complimentary of this is something that needed to happen. This is something that had to happen at the end of the day. But also there were some gripes. The roster cap is something that they're very worried about because they like having their walk-on guys. They like having that ability to go to their well and find a guy that they, need in the back end. They like having this stability in practice, that type of thing. So that is getting a little bit of pushback. We'll see what happens with the scholarship reductions and that type of thing. But also, Jaden Rashada has been a huge topic of conversation, and we finally got to hear from that guy right there, Billy Napier. We got to hear what he thought about this case, what his kind of words were, and obviously he didn't have much to say because it is an ongoing lawsuit. You don't necessarily want to say anything out of turn by any means. So, but let's start with Greg Sankey. He said, plain and simple, he is not a fan of lawsuits. That is basically all he said about that. He is not very interested in talking about it. I don't think he's very interested in the possibility of this because I think he knows that this is not the last one. In fact, he kind of said as much when he was talking about this, that this is kind of the way of the world and you're going to have to, fight these battles from time to time. Obviously not what you want to be battling, especially from the SEC commissioner standpoint, but it's kind of the reality of college sports right now. Also, Billy Napier had something to say. Essentially, didn't say very much, had a very diplomatic answer, but he did say he was comfortable with his actions, which honestly speaks volumes to me. It shows that, one, the Florida contingent and Billy Napier's contingent is fairly confident in where they stand in this case, and some of that might be because there's not a lot of NCAA rules to enforce. Obviously, this will be, in a court of law, so a little bit different of a circumstances, but you can bring up those NCAA rules in that court of law, and possibly that helps you out in this case going forward. And then Kirby Smart was asked about it, really didn't have a ton to say about it. He said, Georgia's not involved, I'm not involved, so not really my problem, was essentially the way he put it. And I think that's the biggest thing about Kirby Smart that I've noticed over, the 6 or 7 or 8 years. I can't even remember how long he's been at Georgia. But the thing about Kirby is no matter what, you can have a million conversations going on. You can have a million things going on. He always keeps the main thing. And always the main thing is going to be winning football games. That is what Georgia fans want to hear. That's what Georgia fans need in their life, is a good Georgia football team. And that's what Kirby Smart does better than anyone in the entire country. He doesn't get caught up in these lawsuits. He's not going to throw, shade at anyone. He's not going to go after Billy Napier or Florida. He's not going to do any of that. He's going to coach football. That's his job. And he's not going to worry about any of the periphery stuff because he's got a really good team on his hands, and they have the ability to do some really remarkable things this upcoming year if, he can not be caught up in all of the outside stuff. So if you're wondering why Kirby Smart is at the very top of the game, that's why. Being able to compartmentalize, all of the outside stuff, all of the NIL stuff, and really focus on what matters, which is winning football games, developing your guys, and putting your guys in chances to succeed. he'll be a winner, and that's the way he's done it for quite some time. Also, some other talking points from there. We had Texas and OU taking part for the very first time. Steve Sarkisian had some comments about Nick Saban joining game day, said he would be a great fit. We had transfers that are still on the market that Texas might be after, might not. It sounds like punter, if there was going to be a position, would be one that they would go after, but I expect them to kind of stand pat. Also, the 12-team playoff has gotten a lot of talk. Majority of teams will be coming from the SEC, if I had to imagine, so obviously makes sense that they're getting a lot of talk. I think one of the really interesting things that I was hoping would get decided this weekend, but is not apparently, is the expansion or not expansion to 9 games in 2025. So this is something that they obviously will talk about around next year or after 2025, excuse me. So they'll talk about it next year and they'll figure out where they stand. I tend to think they'll move to 9 games, but also when you're the SEC, you don't necessarily have quite as big of a push to move to 9 games as some other conferences do, because if you see some of the 8 games that these teams play, it's an absolute gauntlet. But you also have a ton of other stuff to talk about. They talked about a penalty possibly setting in for not reporting injuries correctly. Steve Sarkisian even threw out the NFL model where you fine coaches and you fine programs if they do not accurately show what the injuries are going into a game week. So it's going to be fascinating to watch kind of that develop. Obviously, Kalen DeBoer stepping into where Nick Saban used to sit is a huge topic of conversation, and will definitely be something that is going to be weird to see pretty much the entire year until we get used to him being in the Crimson. But it's a really interesting time of year. You know, you have a ton of stuff going on. You have a ton of talking points around the SEC. I think one of the most interesting ones to me is just how many coaches are not very happy with part of the new house settlement case, the part with the roster caps and possibly scholarship caps, because they like having, 120 guys, 130 guys on their roster because it gives them flexibility, not only in game day, but also in practice. You have the ability to have guys that, run scout team, and maybe if you need to bring them up for a day, they can run third string or fourth string guys. So it's a little bit of it makes roster construction, roster management that much harder. And it makes, it takes away some of the majesty of college football, where you have the stories of Stetson Bennett, you have the stories of Baker Mayfield, where they were walk-ons that found their way to the promised land and did incredible things during college football. So it's kind of it's a double-edged sword. You want smaller schools to have the chance at some more players, which I think would happen if, say, the cap was set at 80 or 100 players, let's say, and you could give scholarships to all of them. Well, that means 30 players that would have been on a Power 5 roster can now go to a Group of 5 roster. So there's a double-edged sword here. I think it, definitely hurts some of these big-time teams where you're going to have to get a little bit better about managing injuries and managing your roster, and maybe it's a little bit of a tightrope walk, I'll be totally honest with you. But also, it does benefit some of the Group of 5 teams in the long run, because you can get some of those high 3-star guys or even low 3-star guys that you probably wouldn't get in the past. So it's kind of one of those things that I think is going to be fascinating to watch. I don't necessarily think that a ton is going to change. I think there's going to be a little bit of a roster, downtick, just a little bit, but I don't necessarily think it'll be quite as aggressive as some that have been thrown out there. I think 85 was thrown out there. I'd be very surprised if that was the number. I think it's going to be 110, probably somewhere a little bit over 100, just because if the SEC coaches feel this way, then probably every coach around the country feels this way. So this is something where we're going to definitely watch it very closely, see how these teams are kind of impacted in the future by this. But also, it's one of those things that I don't necessarily think it's too big of a fight. I think you'll be able to find kind of a middle ground between the two and have the ability to maybe have walk-ons, maybe not, but also whether they're walk-ons or not, the story is still incredible if a kid comes from, the 5th spot on the depth chart all the way up to the top and makes some great plays. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. I think it's one of those things where you look at it and you're not really that worried about that part being too big of a hang-up. I think the SEC meetings are obviously going to be really fascinating to watch this year. So many new faces, so many new teams that are going to be kind of introduced to the conference this year, and we'll see kind of how they're treated in that room. We saw Steve Sarkisian and Mike Elko get together. Definitely a rivalry that will be budding for quite some time around there in the SEC. It sounded like Steve Sarkisian was very, very excited about being able to get into the SEC, get Texas A&M and Arkansas back on the schedule on a regular basis, because those are teams that Texas just has to be playing. I love the Texas Tech game. I love the TCU game, but when you talk about rivalries with Texas, Arkansas and A&M absolutely blow those out of the water. So I cannot wait for this kind of new iteration of the SEC. I think OU playing Missouri every year is going to be something to watch as well. So we'll wait on a Brent Venables, Eli Drinkwitz handshake, but it's going to be incredible to watch this new conference kind of take shape, see who is sitting up top. You know, we feel like it's Georgia right now. We feel like Texas is right up there with them, but who knows? This is a year that a lot of things could be turned on their head. Kalen DeBoer could come in and absolutely, assert his dominance, say that it's the same old Alabama as always, and really become a team to play to mess with. And then you have a ton of other teams to watch: Ole Miss, Missouri. So the SEC is one of those conferences that, from the outside in, it looks like we fully understand what's going to go on. We fully understand the tiers in that conference. It might just not be that simple. So we'll definitely break that down, more of the stuff coming out of these spring meetings, and obviously more SEC football as we get closer and closer to kickoff. But we're going to take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Nyck Harbor, a South Carolina wide receiver, tight end, edge rusher, whatever you want to call him. He's an elite athlete, and he might just be heading to the Olympics this summer, but not for football, obviously, but for track. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the SEC spring meetings, tons of stuff going on around there. Obviously, the House settlement case is going to be a huge topic of conversation, as is the Jaden Rashada lawsuit against Billy Napier and a Florida booster. But that is obviously something we will cover throughout the next week or so. But let's get into Nyck Harbor, and let's talk about this guy, because if you've heard the name, you might have heard the name in the last couple of weeks. If you have, it's not because of football, which sounds weird. This is a South Carolina tight end, wide receiver, edge rusher. Who knows what he is? He's just remarkable. But if you've heard his name recently, it's because of track, his other sport. He was a track star for the Gamecocks this upcoming year, and might just be heading to the Olympics at some point here soon. So this is a very fascinating guy. This is one of those guys that you just want to see on the football field as soon as possible. I want to see him as much as I can, and it seems like we might have to wait just a little bit to see him. He was a very talented 5-star wide receiver coming in last year, had about 12 catches, about 200 yards really a year ago, so not necessarily the most productive year in the world, but this is a kid that the ceiling is sky high. There's no two ways about that. He can do really, really incredible things. I think he's going to be a go-to option for them this upcoming year. Now, the problem with that is he is currently going through kind of Olympic trials, getting into the Olympic circuit right now for sprinting, and the dude is crazy fast. I'll put it that way. He put up a personal best about a week ago, I think, when he ran a 20:20 in a 20-meter and 200-meter dash, and then you also had him run a 100-meter dash in 10.11, which is faster than Tyreek Hill, to give you an idea of what this kid's about. And he's not just a wide receiver. He's an edge rusher. He can play tight end. So this is a bigger body. I have no earthly idea how he can move that quickly. this might be the outright best athlete in the entire country. He can do things on the football field that are absolutely insane. He can do things on the track that are maybe more insane. He really is the top 0.0001% of people on planet Earth when it comes to athleticism. Dude's an absolute freak of nature, and it's a very interesting conversation because there's obviously a guy that is doing incredible things on the track, and you want to, let him live that out. But also, he's missing big time for the football team during spring. He's missed some different practices and things of that nature, and it's definitely not necessarily ideal for that team. But Shane Beamer has been very, very made no question about it. He has said time and again that this is what he wants to do, and he is absolutely supportive of him doing that. And I very much, applaud him for doing that, because I don't know that every football coach would have the same reaction. I do believe that the majority of them would be very, supportive of him and push him in that direction. But also, you want that guy, on the football field. You want that guy preparing for the upcoming year, because he's going to be a huge player for you. So he's going to be really, really interesting to watch. The Olympic trials will be held in June in Oregon, so it'll be really, really interesting to watch. I think if he runs well, he could be in the Olympics in Paris in July 26th and running through August 1st. So that would definitely create a little bit of a problem, but the reality is, he's doing something that is far beyond South Carolina football. That's far beyond college football in general. When you have a chance to go to the Olympics, it's no question. This kid should absolutely pursue that to the full degree that he can. Now, if it doesn't work out, find your way back to Columbia, South Carolina, and let's get to work. But the reality is, this kid is doing really, really remarkable things. And I think when you look at how, a lot of things work today, where you got to pick a sport or you got to be a specialist or things like that, I love when a kid is not only able but encouraged to play multiple sports, especially at the college level. I think especially track, when you're talking about football players, that is the sport that I think a lot of football coaches would like their guys to be playing around this time of year, would like to be participating in. I never know if it's playing or not, but this guy is just absolutely remarkable. Let's talk about him on the football field a little bit, because he's someone that came in as a wide receiver. He was the 15th player in the country in 2023 and was just absolutely remarkable. Chose South Carolina over Maryland and Michigan during his prospects, and came in as a wide receiver and played wide receiver his first year. Now he can move into tight end. I tend to believe that's probably where he will end up. He's kind of that Kyle Pitts type prototype, where a little bit more of a wide receiver body, but has the physicality to work inside as a tight end, especially the length to work inside as a tight end. So I think he's going to be fascinating to watch. Some people wanted him to be an edge rusher when he came into college, because of his, elite athletic ability and ability to get off the edge incredibly fast. So I think it's going to be fascinating to watch. Frankly, I don't know how he fits into this team. I think you could put him anywhere, and he would be a remarkable player, to be totally honest with you. If it were up to me, I'd love to see him on both sides of the ball, playing wide receiver and edge rusher, but that's not really possible. The amount of battering that he would take playing edge rusher and possibly wide receiver / tight end would just be too much for him to take. So I don't necessarily expect that to happen. Now, I would love to see it happen. If we could turn off injuries for one player in the country, I might just do it for this kid right here, but he's one of those guys that is going to be remarkable to watch, not only on the football field, but on the track over the next little bit. If he finds his way to Paris, and then, I don't think he's going to win a gold medal or do anything crazy, but let's say he finds his way to Paris and does, incredible things there, and then after August 1st finds his way back down to South Carolina and tears apart, the SEC this upcoming year. It could be one of the best stories in college athletics. It could be one of the best stories in sports over the last little bit, because that is a feat that we have not seen in quite some time, and I don't know how often we'll see it in the future. So it'll be really interesting to watch this develop. Obviously, him not being there right now is less than ideal. It's not necessarily what you want for your team, especially when you're breaking in a new quarterback in Lenora Sellers, who isn't necessarily the greatest passer in the world. So you want that connection between him and especially Nyck Harbor to really develop as quickly as possible. There's so many different things that kind of go on. I think you're fighting kind of a weird battle if you're South Carolina, because obviously you support him to go do what he wants to do, and there's no two ways about that, and you absolutely should do that, because he deserves that type of support, and he deserves to go off and, do the things that he wants to do, especially on the track, and especially possibly getting to the Olympics. But also, you're going into a year that's super important. Shane Beamer is in a position where he's done great things for his first 2 years, but it feels like the kind of aura and effect is kind of starting to wear off around there. It feels like people are starting to be like, okay, let's start winning some more football games. Let's start building some things up in Columbia. So it'll be interesting to see how this season develops. I think Nyck Harbor is one of those guys that you put him anywhere on the field, he's going to make a difference for you. And honestly, he could miss the rest of fall camp and miss a lot of the stuff, and I still think he could be a difference maker. But when you talk about the SEC, as we've talked about a number of times on here, you're splitting hairs. You're deciding between, you're trying to make 1% better. You're trying to get 1% better so you can jump a couple of teams, because the reality is there are a lot of teams in that middle part of the SEC that are really clumped up, and South Carolina finds themselves a little bit lower on that list than they would probably like, and Nyck Harbor is one of those guys that could take them much, much higher on that list throughout that time. But at the end of the day, it's one of those things that you can, put your college football team ahead of everything else, and you can, prioritize that to the nth degree, which is what I think Shane Beamer does, to no question about it. But also, this guy has a chance to do something that very few people on planet Earth get a chance to do, which is represent his country in the Olympics and do something that, let's be totally honest, is a lot bigger than Columbia, South Carolina. And I think it's one of the coolest stories in college football this upcoming year. It's one of the coolest stories over the next couple of weeks as he goes into Olympic trials up in Eugene and tries to compete to get to that next level. So he's one of those guys that I'm going to be watching incredibly closely, especially coming around to the football season, because I think the ways that they can use him are so plentiful, it's going to be insane. You can put him outside at wide receiver and have him be kind of a red zone threat. You can put him at tight end, and he can be a really solid blocking guy while also being the pass catcher that he's capable of being. You could move him over to defense and play him at edge rusher. Now, they probably won't do that because of the time that they have with him before the season starts, but that is a possibility. That's how good this guy is. And then on top of all that, if they wanted to snap the ball to him, they absolutely could. And he could just run Wildcat and do the things that he does, because this is truly, I think, the best athlete in the entire country. I think there's incredible athletes all over the place. When you talk about Abdul Carter, when you talk about Caleb Downs, James Pierce Jr., Luther Burden, it's incredible how many guys around the country, and particularly in the SEC, are that remarkably talented. But this kid's on a totally different level because he's going to the Olympics. It kind of shows you where he is on the level of, it's great to be a great college athlete. It's a totally different game to be an Olympian. So he's someone that is just remarkable to watch. He was number one on Andrew Ivan's freak list when he came out in 2023, and he might be the number one freak in all of college football right now, to be totally honest with you. I think he's one of those guys that you have a team like South Carolina where maybe you don't feel the most confident going into this year. Maybe you don't necessarily love where you're at with a lot of the different things going around. But when you have Nyck Harbor, a lot of those worries are kind of subsided a little bit. He's one of those guys that totally transforms a team, totally transforms a program. I think he can be a player that makes makes Shane Beamer very, very happy, and definitely gets him a little bit further down the line where he wants to be with this South Carolina team, and where they kind of showed they could be with Spencer Rattler and some different parts of his tenure there. So I think this guy is going to be fascinating to watch. I think Lenora Sellers is going to be fascinating to watch with South Carolina. And overall, this team is just going to be one of those teams where I don't have a beat on them. I have very little idea of how they're going to work out, of how they're going to, be configured this upcoming year, but I can bet $1 million that Nyck Harbor will be a huge part of that offense, and feel very, very confident that that is going to be the case. So I think he's someone that is going to be really fascinating to watch. South Carolina is going to be fascinating to watch, but we're going to have to wait a little bit to watch Nyck Harbor. Maybe you'll get to see him on your TV for the Olympics sometime this summer, but at the end of the day, we're going to have to wait a little bit to see him on the football field, and honestly, that's more than fine if you have a chance to do something like go to the Olympics. So it's going to be awesome to watch that story, one of the best stories in all of college football right now, and he is one of the best players in all of college football and has the chance to be just remarkable this upcoming season. So incredible story, really, really cool to watch, and definitely something that I will be following very closely over the next little bit. So, but we'll take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the most important players that are non-quarterbacks, of course, for the big-time contenders this upcoming year. Yesterday, we got into the most important coach for Georgia, Texas, Bama, Ohio State, Oregon. We're going to do the same thing, but with players this time around. So stick with us, and we'll be right back with that.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about Nyck Harbor and how he is one of the most remarkable athletes on planet Earth right now. He is one of those guys that is going to be fascinating to watch on the football field, but for time being, you're going to have to tune into the track events to see him. He is someone that could make a run at an Olympic berth, so if you haven't seen that story, definitely check out that last segment I just did. But let's jump into the most important players for some big-time teams out there. And let's start with CJ Allen. He is a guy for Georgia that I think holds a lot of cards for them this upcoming year. He is someone that could totally transform what they can be this upcoming season, and it was a little hard to pin this one down. I'll be totally honest with you. I think CJ Allen, is a on-odds favorite to be a big-time player, maybe the best player on this defense, but at the end of the day, well, Malachi Starks might be up there as well. Honestly, I could have chosen Malachi Stark. I could have chosen Nazir Stackhouse. I think he's going to be hugely important to their success this upcoming year. But from where I'm sitting, at least, CJ Allen is going to be the engine of this defense. He is going to be the leader. He is going to be possibly the guy with the green dot on the back of his helmet, although Smile Munden is absolutely someone else that can do that as well. I think CJ Allen has the ability to be a Roquan Smith type player. I think he can do things on a football field that not many guys can do. He can drop back into coverage. He can, play the run really well. He can play in the middle of the field. He can play as a rover. He can do just really, really remarkable things on the football field. And I think he's going to be an absolute beast. I think he's going to take full control of that defense and be a very vocal leader even as a sophomore in that room. So I love this kid. I think this linebacker room is absolutely loaded. Definitely a room that everyone envies around the country. But I think when we talk about CJ Allen, it's just in a little bit different of a tone. This guy has the ability to not only be a really good player this year, but be one of the better linebackers that has ever come out of Georgia, if you were to ask me. I think he can do just remarkable things. One of my favorite players in the entire country. So I think while I could have probably gone Malachi Starks because that back end needs some leadership there, I think I could have gone Nazir Stackhouse because the front end needs some help as well. I think when you talk about this defense, there is one guy in particular that can take it to an entirely different level, and I think that's CJ Allen. So I tended to go in that direction. Definitely will be a fascinating guy to watch this upcoming year, and we'll make some plays that will make your jaw drop. I can say that pretty confidently. And then we'll move on over to Texas and talk about Jaden Barron. He is someone that honestly might have been a little bit overshadowed in Texas offseason. You had so many great things happen for Texas this offseason where you had a ton of big-time transfers come in, like Isaiah Bond, Matthew Golden, all those big-time guys. You had a ton of guys go to the NFL draft, and that was a huge thing for them. But I think the biggest thing in this offseason for Texas was that guy coming back. I think Jaden Barron is so important to this team's ability, especially on the back end of that defense. And when you look at this team, I've talked about this a number of times where in the SEC, you can have a lot of really good players. You can have guys at every single level that are really good. if you don't have 11 guys that can play together, you're going to run into an issue. And to do that, you need really, really good leadership, and there's no one that is going to be a bigger leader for this defense and maybe for the entire team than Jaden Barron. I think him and Quinn Ewers kind of set the tone around there, definitely are the most vocal and the most aggressive leaders, which is probably a good thing from where they're standing. And when you look at this Texas secondary, there's some questions there, right? There are a ton of guys that have a ton of ability and definitely can make things work if they play their best football, but you also do have a little bit of a worry where last year it wasn't necessarily what you wanted it to be, and you definitely want to take a big time step forward. Well, Jaden Barron, I think, makes all that work. I think you have a ton of really talented guys, and I think they would have been fine if they didn't have Jaden Barron. I just think everything fits because of him. I think you have, the corners fit into their specific places. There was talk about him moving outright to corner this offseason, but I think he'll end up playing nickel if I had to guess. But I think he's someone that really makes everything fit. You can have Andrew Makuba, you can have Michael Taff on the back end, and then you have Jaden Barron as a kind of rover who can do just insane things on the defensive side of the ball, both in run game and the pass game. A little bit better in the run game, but definitely still very talented in coverage. And then you have Malik Muhammad, who I think is going to be one of the better corners in the entire SEC this upcoming year. And you have brought in Javian Cole on the other side, Gavin Holmes on the other side. So there's tons of ability on this defense. It just feels like you needed the guy to set the tone, and this is the guy to do that. So I very much like Jaden Barron. I think him coming back is as big of a thing that happened for Texas in the entire offseason. But let's move on to Bama, and let's talk about Malachi Moore. This guy is maybe one of the most important players in the entire country, if we're being totally honest. When you look at this Alabama team, there is so many questions. There are so many different things moving around, so many different moving parts that it's a absolute blessing to have guys like Malachi Moore on that team, to have guys like Jalen Milroe on that team, Deontay Lawson, a ton of these guys that have been there and did not waver when Nick Saban left, decided to come back, decided to be a part of this team, and are going to be huge for their success. And I think Malachi Moore, maybe more than anyone else, I talked about it, a couple of times on here where if the Bama defense is going to be, not necessarily great, it's because the back end struggles. I don't necessarily have any other questions about their ability. Maybe some pass rush issues, but I think Kane Womack does an incredible job of dialing up blitzes, so not necessarily super worried about that. The back end, I'm a little bit worried about. Now, they did a great job portaling in some guys and bringing in guys that they absolutely need, King Mack and I'm blanking on his name right now. It'll come to me at some point. But bringing in some guys on that back end is hugely important. But Malachi Moore is the vocal leader. Malachi Moore is the guy that gets everyone into place, that makes everyone assured that you come to Bama, you're going to work a certain way. And that's definitely a huge asset for Bama this upcoming year, that you have all those guys that understand what the standard is. Not only, the standard under Kalen DeBoer, but just the Bama standard overall. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. I think he is one of those guys that if he, plays really well and he can get everyone into shape and make sure that this back end is in order, Alabama's a national title contender. If, it falls off a little bit and things struggle back there, it could get a little ugly pretty quickly. I'll be totally honest with you. But let's move on over and let's talk about Josh Simmons. He's definitely someone that is super important to Ohio State. And this one's a little bit tough to pin down because I think there's a ton of different things that they need. I think they need a linebacker that can be a leader. I think Sonny Styles will be more than fine at doing that. But at the end of the day, when you look at this team, there's not a ton of holes. There's not a ton of issues, and there's not a ton of players that if they go down, you're going to have big problems. Now, I think Josh Simmons could be one of those guys. He was a solid player last year, had a 71.9 pass blocking grade, had a 65.8 run blocking grade. So definitely a very, very talented kid, definitely someone that can do really, really good things on the football field. Now, he does need to take a big-time step forward in the run blocking area, because the reality is when you look at this offense for Chip Kelly, he wants to get out on the edge. He wants to use his running backs and maybe Will Howard to get out on the edge, and he's going to have to be able to set that edge and seal the edge on the left side. And if he can't do that, then it's going to be a problem. There's no two ways about that. I think he's someone that has a ton of ability, came over from San Diego State a year ago, and I think has a ton of ability to be a great player for them. But there's definitely a little bit of worry there. There's definitely, if he doesn't take a step forward from a year ago, you might have a couple of uncomfortable conversations, I suppose. And also, when you have the most important job on the field, which is protecting the quarterback's blind spot, you're going to be a very important player to that team. So I think keeping Will Howard upright is as important of a thing in the world. I think if he can stay upright, he is going to be a big-time player for them. But let's move on to Oregon, and let's talk about Jeffrey Bassa, because this guy might be the most overshadowed guy, maybe in the entire country. When you talk about his ability at the linebacker position, it's just absolutely insane what he can do. I think he can do remarkable things on the linebacker position. I think he can do things that are going to totally change the way that we go, or the way that we look at Oregon this upcoming season. I think he can do just ridiculous things. And when you look at Oregon, there's a couple of things that you're a little bit worried about, right? That D-line is a little bit worrisome. That back end, you have a lot of guys coming in from transfer portal places that are very talented kids, but you never really know what they're going to look like until they get on campus. But I think this guy is one of those hearts of a defense, right? Kind of the CJ Allen type example that we had earlier, where he's the guy that knows what the standard is, kind of like Malachi Moore we talked about earlier. He's the guy that if, a transfer portal guy, especially on the defensive side of the ball, needs some help learning something or needs some help with, figuring out where they need to be or alignment or things like that, he's the guy that they're going to go to. So I think he's going to be hugely important to making this defense work the way that they want it to up there and be the player that he can definitely be, because remarkably talented, and definitely with all the help that he's going to have around him will definitely help him take that next step. But he's going to be hugely important to the success of Oregon this upcoming year. But we're going to take our final break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the Kentucky Wildcats, a very, very interesting team going into this year. Brock Vandagriff coming over has definitely put a little bit more of a spotlight on them, so I'll be very fascinated to watch them this upcoming year, but we'll break down what they could look like in 2024 right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the most important players for the big time teams in the country. Definitely a lot of guys on the defensive side of the ball for some of those teams. Definitely a hugely important part of the game for some of the big time teams around there. But let's talk about the Kentucky Wildcats here, and this is a very interesting year. I am a big-time fan of Kentucky, I'll be totally honest with you. I'm going to keep my bias out of this, I promise. But if you've watched Josh Payton and you know his relationship with Iowa State, that's going to be my relationship with Kentucky this year. So this is a really remarkable team. I think it's a team that might be a little bit overshadowed, to be totally honest with you, with all of the other things going on in the SEC. This is a team that's kind of just a little bit under the radar, and that might be what Mark Stoops wants to be happening, to be totally honest with you. I think they're a very interesting team. Let's go through this the way we always do, offense, defense, schedule, and then we'll do some final thoughts at the end. Offense is going to be led by Bush Hamden this upcoming year, an OC that came over from Boise State, a very talented guy that definitely will be a quick riser in this industry. But then you also brought in Brock Vandagriff, and he is the absolute key to Kentucky's success. He's going to be the guy that, if he can play a little bit better than Devin Leary did a year ago, show off some of that arm talent, be very accurate, which it sounds like he's been all of those things in spring practice, then he could be absolutely incredible. He has tons of weapons around him, and the defense is not too shabby by any means either. But the running back room is one of those that you would like a little bit more from, but not necessarily bad by any means. You have Chip Trainum, who came in from Ohio State. You also have Demi Sumo Caringbe. You also have Jamarian Wilcox, Jason Patterson. So you have some guys there. Definitely guys that can fill in some gaps, but definitely would love kind of that go-to definite back up there. But Chip Trainum, I think, will be more than fine, and I think they'll have a good run game because I think they have a good pass or run blocking offensive line for sure. And then you look at that wide receiver room, and that's really where the show starts, in my opinion. Berrien Brown is the one that leads the way. His speed is just insane. It's essentially get the ball in his hands and let him go to work because he can do just crazy things with the ball in his hands. Then you have Dane Key, an elite route runner, very, very veteran guy that can definitely be a third down type guy where if you need a catch, you can go to this guy and he is going to be sure-handed. You have Anthony Brown-Stevens, who's going to be a really good outside player that definitely could be a deep threat this upcoming year. And then Jamori Macklin, you add to that group, and I think he's going to do just remarkable things. He's a very good route runner, can definitely be a guy that when one of those guys goes out, you bring in another guy and you don't necessarily miss a beat because he did remarkable things at North Texas a year ago. I think you can have an absolutely special team here and a special group, especially at wide receiver. And then you talk about offensive line. It starts with Marquise Cox. Marquise Cox is one of the best left tackles, one of the best offensive tackles in the entire country. He is really, really remarkable. Now, the rest of this offensive line is solid. They've all played a fair amount of snaps. Dylan Ray, Eli Cox, Yeager Burton have all played a fair amount of snaps, including last year. You also brought in Gerald Mincy from Tennessee, who is slated to be a big-time player for them at right tackle. So this is a group that it's a little bit of Marquise Cox and everyone else just because of how good Marquise Cox is, but it feels like they have a good five. They have a five that at the very least can hold up well enough to get this offense moving and definitely get Brock Vandagriff moving because the entire thing rides on him, if I'm being totally honest. If I'm being totally honest, I think when you look at Brock Vandagriff, if he can hit and be the guy that a lot of people saw when he came out of high school, and the guy that he probably still is, he was just at Georgia and was behind some really, really good players at quarterback there, they could be up there in the SEC. The ceiling doesn't necessarily exist for this team, and I'll break it down more on the defensive side of the ball because frankly, I didn't fully realize how good this defense was. I watched them a year ago a ton when I was doing some work for Sports Info Solutions, but at the end of the day, I didn't realize how many guys came back and how many important guys came back. So it all starts with Deone Walker. He is one of the best players in the entire country, if I'm being totally honest. And that guy right there, he can do just remarkable things at the defensive tackle position. Then you have guys right next to him like Keyshawn Silver, Josiah Hayes, Octavius Oxidine, just remarkable players. All guys that can have big time effects, and also you don't necessarily have to be the number one player. When Deone Walker is taking up that much attention, you're going to have chances to make plays on one-on-one situations. So it'll be fascinating to watch that. The edge rushing will be very solid. You have J.J. Weaver leading the way, very long, athletic guy. Trayvon Rybka is a very, very talented kid as well. And then Tyrese Fearby and Khalil Saunders coming off the bench are going to be really good. And then Brian Robinson, a freshman that they are sky high on around Lexington, definitely will be a big-time player for them. The linebackers are a really solid group. You brought in Jamon Dumas-Johnson from UGA is absolutely huge, replacing Trayvon Wallace, from a year ago, and very, very talented kid. And then you have De'Eric Jackson coming back, a very fundamentally sound middle linebacker, definitely a guy that can hold it down while Jamon Dumas-Johnson does what makes him special and kind of roves around the field and makes some really athletic plays. Then you have DeVern Rayner and Noah Matthews coming off the bench, who are very, very talented linebackers as well, just a little bit younger and don't necessarily have the snaps under their belt that the other guys do. Now, the back end has absolute dudes. I love this back end. I think it starts with it starts with Maxwell Harrison, let's be totally honest, but Alex Afari is someone that I'm watching incredibly closely. He is kind of the Swiss Army knife for this team, will drop back and play deep safety, can play in the box, can do remarkable things, plays slot corner at times when he needs to, so is a very, very talented guy, is definitely someone that is going to be a huge part of their team. Zion Childress and Jordan Lovett were both big-time starters for them a year ago at safety. They'll be right back there, so we'll be very confident in them. Maxwell Harrison is one of the better corners in the entire country, especially outside corners who can really make him remarkable plays on the ball. He's right there, probably returning one of the pick 36 as he had a year ago. And then you have Jonquise Hardaway, who is very, very talented player. He's replacing Andrew Phillips from a year ago. So the defense overall is going to be good. There's no two ways about that. I think when you talk about a couple of players that could step up and make it elite, I think you talk about De'Aaron Jackson at the linebacker position, or maybe Alex Afari or Jordan Lovett at the safety position, because you're going to need a guy to take that next step, to go to the next level. But there's plenty of guys that can do that, to add to the Deone Walkers of the world, to add to the Maxwell Harrisons of the world. Adding one other guy to that will be just remarkable to watch. So love this team overall, but let's look at the schedule and see just what they're up against, because there's a lot. Let's be totally honest with you. Week 1 is a layup. There's no two ways about that. South Carolina should be a very interesting game, but one they should likely win, especially at home. But overall, this schedule is doable. I think there is definitely not necessarily the greatest breaks in some aspects, but I definitely think there are places that you can make all of this work, where you have an out-of-conference game, then 2 in-conference games that are going to be hugely important. Georgia at home is one of those games that if you win it, you're totally changing your program overnight. And then you have Ohio before going to Ole Miss, which I think is going to be maybe the most important game on this entire schedule, if I'm being totally honest. If they win that game, they're on a totally different echelon than they would be if they lose that game, and they're kind of where Kentucky usually is. But also having to go to Ole Miss, having to go to Florida, Tennessee, and Texas is really tough. Splitting those 4 would be really good, if I'm being totally honest. That would be a huge win. Now, they likely should beat Florida, at least from a roster perspective, but the other 3 are going to be very sketchy, and Florida's going to be very sketchy because you got to go to Florida and play in the swamp, so it's never going to be easy. But I think the stretch that I'm watching most closely is the Florida game to the Tennessee game. So at Florida, Auburn, and then at Tennessee. If they can somehow, if they go 2-1 in that stretch, I think it's a great win. If they go 3-0 in that stretch, we're looking at Kentucky in an entirely new light, especially going into the last couple of weeks in the season. They have a bye, and then Murray State at Texas, which is a game that right now I think a lot of people are penciling in as a win for Texas because they're at home, because they're playing a team that on paper is not as good as they are, but Kentucky could be a wildly different team, at least from perspective standpoint, by the time we get there. So it'll be really remarkable to watch this team. I think when you look at this team overall, I can see 10 wins. I can also see 7 wins. So I can see this team do really remarkable things. I think that guy, Deone Walker, is going to have as much to say as anyone, really, about what this team can do. But when you look at this team overall, it's Brock Vandagriff. You'd love to say that this really good defense can get them all the way to where they need to be. You would love to say that all of these wide receivers and some of the ability is going to get them there, but you need the guy to push the right buttons. And Devin Leary did a really good job early in the season and then tapered off during the SEC schedule. Brock Vandagriff's not going to have a ton of time to get ready for the SEC schedule. They're going to be thrown right into the fire with South Carolina and Georgia early on, and if he can handle those, we'll have an idea of what Kentucky can be. Because if Brock Vandagriff, say, Georgia walks into town, his former team, and maybe they don't win, but maybe they lose by 7 points, and he has a really good game, people are going to start looking at Kentucky, and they absolutely should be right now, but that's a problem we can deal with during the season. There is a world where they go on the road to Oxford, beat Ole Miss, and are 7-1 entering the Tennessee game. If that happens, we are having a weird conversation around Kentucky that I think a lot of people are not prepared for. And then say you beat Tennessee. Let's just live in hypothetical world here for a second. Say you beat Tennessee, and even if you lose to Texas and beat Louisville, you might be in the playoff as a 10-2 team for Kentucky. So this is one of those teams where I've seen Mark Stoops do a ton with a lot less talent than this. I've seen Mark Stoops do a ton with a defense that's not as good as this one, or an offense that is not as talented, or a quarterback that is not quite as talented as the one that he has in front of him. Now, can they take that next step in 2024? Can they become a team that is not only to be reckoned with in the SEC East, that is no longer a thing, but to be reckoned with in the SEC as a whole, and maybe a national conversation? So Kentucky, I think there's a little bit of a worry, right? The offensive line is not necessarily quite as strong as you want it to be. There's definitely some holes in this team, but there's a lot of stuff there that has not been there in the past. And I think it's something that Mark Stoop is kind of salivating at the mouth because he has talent that he hasn't had there maybe in his entire tenure. So he'll be fascinating to watch. This team will be fascinating to watch. And I think if we look up in November and Kentucky is a team with one loss, don't say I didn't tell you. I'll put it that way. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We have incredible people doing work for every sport in the world, so don't worry about that. If you need anything in the world of sports, come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered. So thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.